Hello, in this video I'm going to be doing some hands-on examples of creating methods from scratch. So once in a while you already know that you want to write a method separately, but more often you realize after you're writing your code, you see that you're duplicating some code or that your code's getting messy, you want it to be more organized. And so then you move your already written code to a new method. So that's the approach that I'm going to take here. I'm going to write out some code. I'm going to save a copy of it for you, the original code with no custom methods, so that you can compare and contrast. And then what I'm going to do is take the same approach I would take if I were coding this from scratch the first time, which is after looking at the code, I will point out where it might be useful to create a custom method to clean up my code. And I'll actually create two custom methods. So you'll see one example where I use parameters, an example where I don't use parameters. And you'll see one example that has a return value and one example where the return value is void. So we're kind of mix and matching here. So I'm going to jump over to Visual Studio, where I have already opened a new Windows Form application project. It's brand new. I called it Dice Games because what this application is it allows the user to play a game where they roll a dice or a die, I should say. For some reason, it's more natural for me to say roll a dice. But they'll roll a dice and see if they win the game. So on this form, the first thing I'm going to add is a button. I'll add it more towards the bottom. And I'm trying to decide. Doesn't really matter where I put it. I'll put it, I guess, kind of at the top. And this button, so I'm going to have different buttons for different games. So my first game is going to be called Sixes. So this button is called the Play Sixes button. And Sixes is a very easy game. You just roll a dice, and if you roll a 6, then you win. Okay, I'm going to add a label. And this label, I'm going to call it the dice result label. And I'm going to have it be blank. So when the user clicks a button, the dice is rolled, and whatever number is rolled is going to appear in this label. And then I'm going to have another label I can never decide where to put things visually. I'll just put it down here. And this label is going to tell the user whether they won or lost. So this one will also start blank. And it will be the win or lose label. Okay, so I'm going to double click on my button, which will create a method. Now that we know a little bit about methods, we understand a little more what happens when we double click that button. Now we know why it says private, because this method is only used within this form. We know why it says void, because the result of clicking this button, stuff happens, but it doesn't give us some string or number that we have to save to a variable. It has no return type. It's non-static. We don't have the static keyword. And we have the method identifier, and then we have the method parameters. So inside this method, I'm going to introduce you to a new concept, which is the random object. So I'm going to create a random object, and I'm going to call it numberGen for number generator, and create it using the new keyword, just like when we create any new object, like a new array or a new stream writer, new stream reader file stream. I'm creating a new object of type random. And what a random object does is it allows you to generate random numbers. So in this case, I want the application to randomly roll the dice and to have it land on some random number. So this isn't something we learned in this chapter of the textbook, but I think it's a very useful and interesting concept, especially if you want to build some sort of like game application. Randomization is always a big part of games. So we're generating a random number for the dice roll. Okay, once we've created our random object, the random object has a method built into it called next. So we state the name of our object. Now we are going to invoke the next method, which is a non-static method, right? Because it's associated with this object. Anytime you have an object or variable name, dot the method name, that's a non-static method. And the parameters that this method takes are two integers. The first integer is the lower bound. So we want a number between 1 and 6. And the second parameter, and in fact you'll see Visual Studio tells you what the parameters are for any method, is the max value, which is an exclusive upper bound, not inclusive. I have no idea why whoever wrote the method this way did it this way. But the upper bound is exclusive. So if I want a number between 1 and 6, then my parameters for this random object .next method are going to be 1 and 7. So this will give me a number between 1 and 6. All right. You'll also notice if you hover over this method, there's a pop-up that tells you what its return type is. It says int random not next. So the result of this method we can save to an integer. So I can say int dice equals number generator dot next 1 through 7. So what we've done here is created a random object and then use that random object to generate a random number between 1 and 6. And the result of that we are saving to a variable that we've called dice. So at this point in time, when the user clicks on the button, we have a variable that represents a number between 1 and 6. So we could, I believe I created a label called the dice result label. Yeah. We could just have that show the user what is that number that we rolled. Okay, so far, what this application does is it rolls a dice, it creates a random number between 1 and 6 and shows it on the screen. So when I click the button, I rolled a 2. Now I rolled a 6, rolled a 2, 1, 6, 3. Okay, every time I click the button, it's rolling the dice to a different number. Now I can check. So since the game that we're designing is 6s, we only win if dice is rolled to a 6. Then we can check using our if statement. If dice is 6, then we can have our win or lose label display. You win. Hooray. Otherwise, if it's anything besides a 6, our label is going to say You lose. Ha ha. So now if we test our application, 5, we lost. 6, we won. 3, we lost. 5, we lost. 2, we lost. 6, we won. Okay, very simple game. Oops, I don't think that was showing on the screen when I was testing it, but I think you get the idea. I was just clicking on the button and it was showing the number and either you win, hooray, or you lose, haha. Okay. Now let's say, so we still haven't gotten to creating custom methods yet. We have introduced a new concept, which was using the random class. But other than that, we're still using the concepts from previous chapters, haven't built a custom method yet. Let's go back to our form. Let's add another button for another game. So in this game, we guess what number the dice is going to roll, and then we check. So I'm going to call this button the guess button, and I'll have its text be play guess. Okay, I'm going to add a text box. So here, the user can input a number, and then when they press the button, it rolls the dice and checks if we guessed right or not. Whoa. I accidentally double-clicked on the form. And I keep accidentally doing it. Delete that out. Okay. So the user is going to input a number. When they press play guess, the dice result is still going to show up and the label whether they won or lost. So I'm going to move these labels actually kind of down towards the middle because these labels are being used in both games, the number that the dice rolled and the message of whether we won or lost. So for the guess game, I'll double click and generate that method. Okay, I'm going to do something similar. So here, I want to generate a random number and display it on the screen. So I could actually even copy and paste this. Okay, I could have typed it from scratch, but that's okay. But here's a little hint for you. If you find yourself copying and pasting code, that means there's probably a more efficient way to do it. And we'll get to that more efficient way in just a minute. But first, let me program this game. So we want to generate a number representing rolling the dice and then show it on the screen. And now in this case, we want to check if the number rolled matches the user's guess. So the user's guess, we can save that as a variable. We just collect it from the text box. Did I change the name of that text box? Oh, I didn't. Okay. So the text box I'm going to rename as guess text box. Okay, so then in my code, we will retrieve whatever is in the guess text box text, convert that to a number, and save that as an integer variable called text. So this, oops, need my semicolon, collect the guess from the user, and then we will check to see. So now if whatever we rolled in the dice and saved in this variable is the same as whatever the user input, then we're going to have the win or lose label display. You win. Hooray. If it doesn't match, then we're going to have that label display. You lose. Haha. Okay, so I am going to save a copy of this code exactly as it is now, so you can have both copies. The copy as it is now inefficiently with no custom methods, and the better code that I'm going to create once I save this code and continue with my example. Okay, so I had saved my code in the background, and now I will continue. You might notice that we are repeating a lot of code. This is not an efficient way to do things. If we keep adding more and more games to our application, we're going to have so much repetitive code. And then if we ever want to change something, we're going to have to change it in however many different games we have. So a more efficient way to code this would be to move some of this code into a separate method and then just invoke that method for each of the games. So for example, one thing that we're repeating, and in fact I literally copied and pasted this code, was creating a random object, generating a number, and displaying that in the label. We did that exact same thing for both of these games. So rather than repeating that code, what we can do is we can move that code into a separate method. So here outside of my guess button click method, I'm going to hit enter a couple times, and I'm going to create my own method that will roll the dice and display the result on the screen. So anytime you're creating methods for this course, if it's just something that's going to be referred to within your own application, it's going to be private. Any methods created within a form are non-static. The return type, I could approach this in a few different ways. One, I think the way that I would like to do it is I want this method to return an integer. So I want, when I invoke this method, for it to roll the dice and then return whatever number was rolled on the die. So I'm going to have that be a return type of int. I'm going to call this method roll dice. And I'm not going to have it accept any parameters. My parameter list is empty because I don't need to input any information. Right? When the user clicks the button to roll the dice, we're not telling it to do anything different. All we want it to do is roll the dice. We're not saying roll the dice depending on what number I give you or what word I input into some text box. All we're doing is rolling the dice. Okay, so there's no input required. So this roll dice method, what I want it to do is these 3 lines of code that I repeated in these methods. So I'm going to copy and then paste that code here. Okay, so anytime I invoke this method, it's going to create a random object and generate a random number between 1 and 6. and it's going to display that number on the application, on the label. And I also want it to return that number so that we can use that number elsewhere in our application. So I could say return dice. So what that is doing is I've done some, in this case, not a calculation, but generated a number and saved it as this integer variable. And now I am returning that integer to whatever statement invoked this method. So up here, rather than having all of this code, I'm just going to have an integer variable. I'll call it, doesn't matter what I call it, dice num. And here I'm going to invoke the method that I created. So now what happens is when the user clicks on the guess button, C# looks and it says, okay, the first thing we have to do is run the roll dice method. So it jumps down to here, runs all of this code. This results in some number. Okay, some integer is returned. So let's say it rolled a 6. In that case, this method has returned the integer 6. So the result of invoking that method is the number 6, which we then save as this variable called dice num. Well, now I've got an error down here because I used to be referring to a variable called dice, and now I'm using a different name. I will say that the variable that you declare here that catches the whatever this method returned, well, I could still have used the name dice here. It can be the same. It could be the same as what you call it inside of your method, or you can call it something different. It doesn't matter. I'll call it something different just so it demonstrates the concept in my code that you don't have to use the same name. It just is that this roll dice method returns an integer variable. Doesn't matter what that integer variable was called inside of the method body. Makes no difference because we have to save it to a new variable outside of that method anyway. Okay, so then we could do the same thing up here. Instead of all of this to roll the dice, we could just have int dice number equals the result of rolling the dice. And here I'd change that to match. So in both of my games, my first step is just to roll the dice. Doesn't matter how that's done. All we know is that we're rolling the dice. Now, down here at the bottom, we do have the details of how exactly that is done. So now, no matter how many games we create, if we want to roll the dice in those games, we don't have to repeat those 3 or 4 lines of code. You know, and if we were doing something more complicated, be more than 3 or 4 lines of code. We don't want to repeat every time. All we have to do is invoke that nice method. Okay, now another thing that you might see similar between these two games is we are checking whether the dice number matches something. So in this case, in this game, we're checking whether the dice number matches 6, and if it does, we win. Down here in this game, we're checking whether the dice number matches the user's guess. And then we put whether they win or lose. So these two sets of code are almost exactly the same, but they're not exactly the same. There is a little bit of a difference. So that gives us a hint that if we want to move this code into its own separate custom method, we're going to want to accept an input parameter, because this method doesn't do this set of code doesn't do exactly the same thing as this. There is a slight difference, and that difference can be captured using our input parameters. So here, let me just create a new method. This method, like all the ones we create for the homeworks, projects, and exams in this class, will be private and non-static. In this case, I don't have a specific variable that I'm going to be returning. I'm just checking checking whether the dice matches some value. I'm going to call this check win. It's just the name I'm giving my method. And I'm going to have some input here. And maybe when I start writing my method, I don't know what that input is yet. So I'm just going to leave a comment to remind myself to go back and replace that with my input parameter. I mean, you could do the same thing here. If you're not sure yet whether you're going to return some value or not, that's totally okay. You can just leave yourself a comment and go back and change it. After you start writing your method body and you realize, oh, I need to actually return a number, or I need to return a string, or oh, I don't need to return anything. Then you can go back and change your method header to match that. So what this method is going to do is it's going to do anything that was repeating in these games, where we're checking whether the dice number matches something. If it does, we type this specific text to the win or lose label, and if it doesn't, we we print this specific text to our win or lose label. So I'm just going to copy and paste that code in my method. Okay. All right, so here we're checking if our dice number matches some specific number. Okay, well, this method doesn't recognize dice number because it's a variable from within another method. So what we can do is we can use that as one of our input variables. So that's an integer. You can call it dice number. Doesn't matter what we call it. Here, let's just call it dice number so it matches what our code already says. And then we want to match it to some number. We don't always want to see if it matches 6. Sometimes we want to see if it matches the input from the user. Okay? So this method is going to run differently depending on what we're matching the dice number against. If we're matching it against the number 6, then it would be 6. If we're matching it against what the user guessed, then it would be matched to that input in that text box. So it's going to be something different every time. So that tells us that we need another input parameter. We'll just call it the match number. Okay, so anytime we invoke this method, we're checking whether the dice number matches some match number. Okay. If it is a match, then we tell the user that they won. If it's not a match, we tell the user that they lost. Okay, so now you'll see there's no return statement because this is a void method. We didn't need to save some value, some string or some number. Now when we want to invoke this method, so here where we checked whether the dice number was equal to the user's guess, rather than explicitly typing all this out, we can just invoke that method that we called check_win. Okay, we can't leave it like this though, because check_win, we've specified when we wrote it that you must input 2 parameters. The first parameter is the dice number, and the second parameter is what you're matching against. So up here, the first parameter is our dice number, which in this case also happens to be called dice num. And Visual Studio even gives you a hint now. It reminds you the first parameter needs to be a dice number, and the second parameter needs to be what you're matching it against. In this case, we're matching the dice number against our guess variable. We collected the user's guess, saved it as an integer variable, and now we're checking whether it matches our dice. So when the user presses the guess button, we first roll the dice. So the application jumps down and executes this code. Then it comes back up and says, okay, the result was 6, so their dice number is 6. Okay, now the user guessed 5. So now we're going to check whether dice number, which is 6, matches guess, which is 5. And so to do that, we're invoking this method. And so it jumps down and executes this code. So is 6 equal to 5? No. So it's going to print you lose out to that label. Okay. So check when our input parameters are the dice number and the guess. Up here, when we check whether or not the user won, our parameters are the dice number and 6. We're just seeing whether the number rolled is the number 6. So you'll see now we've kind of compartmentalized our code. We've eliminated repetitive code. Okay, so we've got our two custom methods, one where we did not accept any input parameters and we had a return type of integer, one where we did accept some input parameters and we had a return type of void. And we can call those as many times as we want. We can create 7, 10, a dozen more games, and we don't have to repeat all this code. So now you see that the code for our games is very simple. The Play Sixes button has 2 lines of code now. We roll the dice, we check whether that dice is whether the dice roll was a 6. The guess button click code now is only 3 lines. We roll the dice, we collect the guess from the user, and then we check whether the dice number from the user matches, or excuse me, the dice number generated by the application matches the guess from the user. Let's go ahead and test this out. So here, if we play 6s, it just rolls the dice and checks whether we won or lost. If we play guess, let's say I'm guessing 6. Nope. I keep losing. Oh, I won once in there. I could guess a different number. And it works.